My name's Philip Mercury, I'm an islander, and welcome to St Helena Virtual Tours Ladder Hill. All I can say, there's so much history in this place that every inch is connected, has got connections or something or associations running through it to do with the British Empire. History's everywhere. The fort itself, unlike some of the fortifications on the island, wasn't really fortified until the 1790s under Governor Brooke. It wasn't really seen as significant, even when the most unfortunate day probably in the East India Company's history, in 1706, French ships came in and stole two East India Company ships, one called the Dover and the Queen, and escaped with them. Now, an engagement ensued. Shots were fired from the castle and they were fired from Mundons. There was no record that this place had guns or indeed fired the guns. Other places, the coastal defences were paramount in defence of this island, while this place was largely neglected until the 1790s. And then Brooke got the water supply from Red Hill up the hill there, and then they had water, and then obviously they could get food stuff and men and machinery from town and ultimately from the ships. That will lead us onto the ladder later. This itself, or possibly over there, which is Ladder Hill Point, more to that where the flagpole is what is known as St Helena's Tower Hill. In the most successful rebellion here, in 1693, called the Jackson Rebellion, ultimately the governor was shot in the castle by Henry Fogg. The rest took hostages on the Francis and Mary, a ship in the bay, negotiated food and provisions. Meanwhile, had earlier stolen the treasure in the castle, spiked the guns in Mundons. They were very clever. Let the hostages go, the Lieutenant Governor Keeling and the Governor Keeling and Girling and some of the head islanders. Let them go and sailed off, presumably America, because they actually took hostage of Captain Pitt of the said Francis and Mary, and he advised America. They were never seen again. But a backlash of that, a year later, slaves were said to be devising a plan where they were going to mimic what the whites had done. And a slave called Amma confessed to her owner. The slaves were gathered up by force, pushed towards the castle under sword. Confessions were made. There was a trial by a white jury. Eventually, 11 were found guilty. The 3 most culpable were brought up here in 1694. That's why we call it St Helena's Tower Hill. They were brought up here, and Jack, the ringleader, the so-called ringleader, was hung in a gibbet and left there and it was in December, and he was left there to cook to death and obviously starve to death, a combination of the two. And the other 2 were hung, drawn and quartered, brought down, hanged, brought down while still alive and quartered. And the remaining 11, they were whipped on 5 occasions with periods of rest so their flesh could heal, and then they went again. They were masters of torture. They're real sadists, something akin to the Holocaust. Only a very, very wicked mind, some of the stuff that the East India Company, the Honourable East India Company, did to this island and their other colonies in Indonesia and India. The other 11 were eventually branded with the letter R, which meant renegade, and sent up country, which would be onwards to Indonesia, Sumatra, etc. for me, it's painful. Just, I know it's a long time ago, but that is just painful for me, because it was like, just like the way that, because a lot of them here, at the same time, that all this rubbish was happening, all these horrors were happening, and at the very same time, there was a guy called William Dufton, D-U-F-T-O-N, had only been on the island for 20 years. Within 140 years, Sir William Dufton was made Knight of the Realm by the King in 1820 in the Royal Pavilion of Brighton. Now, if that's not social climbing, I don't know what. Meanwhile, us poor saints, in 1820, we were still waiting 6 years, and on paper, and not until 1836 to have full emancipation on the island. Thanks to Wellington, we didn't get emancipation here. The rest of the British Empire got emancipation in 1833. Meanwhile, because Wellington decided to put a clause in that affected St Helena and Ceylon, we didn't get full emancipation to 1836. And then after slavery finished, and then the bulk of the slave community were left in dire poverty, which led to awful social ills. World-renowned Jacob's Ladder, 699 steps, was 700, apparently one was lost in building maintenance, possibly in the 1870s by 1874, something like that, by the Royal Engineers that came here to renovate the ladder, High Knoll, and a lot of other military installations. The ladder itself was devised, it was an idea by the new governor, Dallas, who was a retired brigadier general in the Madras Army in 1829. By 1831, it had already been operational a year, and the first year was free of charge. It cost the government at the time, the East India Company, cost them £1,150. Doesn't sound a lot, it was quite a few quid then, obviously. It would have been built by recently freed men of colour that had not long finished the school, which was praised in the records as the first great achievement by the native free men of colour, and they would have come up here under the command of Lieutenant Mellis of the Santolina artillery. But obviously, you know a fair thing about engineering too. It was designed by a guy, engineer in town called J.W. Hall. And the interesting thing, they called themselves the railway company because it was very soon privatised, and it was sold to a share scheme. 300 shares floated up, not floated, but you know, locally floated, and £900. So they'd already made a loss on it, but I suppose, you know, it's all cyclical history, right? And even St Helena, cyclical history, trying to promote private industry on this island. As early as 1820, 1829, in the early 1830s, trying to promote private enterprise. And it worked with a capstan. I'm not a mechanical-minded person, but it was a capstan lever system with 3 donkeys up here somewhere, pulling the weight up and down 2 carriages. There was also a walkway. I don't think it was that one where it is today, could be, but the one we're looking at now is a complete renovation by the Royal Engineers, who came, the 7th Battalion, I believe, of the Royal Engineers. So there's 500 men plus the band. They came in, I can't remember what it says on that, 1873, 4-ish time. Anyway, they built all of the little barracks all around there. They've left their mark on the side, Royal Engineers. And obviously they were significant here because they did a lot of work. Unfortunately for the ladder, it fell quickly when the East India Company went over to, lost its license, for want of a better word, and went back over to the Crown. The investment wasn't there on the poor old railway company, and it soon fell, it soon became dilapidated. And there was a call in the Boer War, bring it back, because obviously there's 5,000 more dudes, 5,000 more mouths to feed on the island all of a sudden. There was a call, everyone said, come on, bring it back, but they didn't. I'm saying, you know, obviously it's a grade one listed building, but I'm saying, you know, cable car. But, you know, that's another argument. We're standing at the top of Ladder Hill Road, leading into the beautiful Jamestown. Very warm here today. The ladder itself, Ladder Hill Fort, was obviously, not obviously because you don't know, was named after the original rope ladders that went down the 600 feet cliffs that we have into town. The original road was a zigzag road, but if you look carefully, you see different roads at different times into the rock face. Governor Pike in, I think it was about 1719, formalised the road, but it wasn't great. And then again in 1770s, they had another go, and they had the final go in 1881-2, and you got in the side of the cliff face there, you've got 1881. And I remember as a kid, when I first saw it, because I was a history geek, I thought, wow, that's 7 years before Jack the Ripper. But any ripperologists there, Frederick Deaning also came here for some weeks in around the right time to be a possible Ripper killer. He was here for a few weeks on passage back to England from South Africa. So if you'd like to look that up, look that up. Okay, astronomy. St Helena has always boasted itself to be the home of astronomy. We had Halley in the very early part of our history in the 1670s, who studied the solar system from the peaks, because obviously when we get stars in St Helena, it really knocks your socks off. It's worth coming just for that, really, honest to God. And later on, we had Mason and Dixon. They came and did a little bit more work. And then by the 1820s, it was suggested by a ship's captain called Hamilton, Captain Hamilton. He was passing on the ship Susan, and he was a budding amateur astronomist. He came to the island and he suggested, he obviously looked up, saw the clarity of the stars and thought, wow, we need an observatory, or you guys, East Indian Company. And East Indian Company had money. They was always open to new ideas. They were innovative, they were cutting edge, complete antithesis of the Crown, which unfortunately took over in 1834. Backtrack. So they decided to invest in an observatory. It was Governor Walker in the late 1820s. And they built it. It was a tower with a dome-covered tower with obviously a big telescope, it was chocker with chronometers, timepieces, etc, etc, state-of-the-art stuff. They spent a fortune on it. They put in charge Lieutenant Manuel Johnson, was chosen to command it, and he was given a lot of money. He was given like £300 and a big thank you in the records, and they must have really loved him, because he was sent on paid furlough to England as well. The East India Company worked that way. If they liked you, you could get social advancement through your connections in the East Indian Company, get your kids as ensigns, the first run. And the great thing about the East Indian Company military, the commissions were free. You just went back home, so-called home, to Addison College in Hertfordshire, studied there for a year. You could come back as an officer on a nice wage. So really, it was cradled, if there's a white man on this island in the 1770s onwards, it was a good old life. All of this here, because obviously it was a hive of activity. You know, now you can't imagine it, but it was just like, whoa! Because at any one time there could be 500 men upwards here, all at any one time, all different regiments. In Napoleon's time, the 53rd, the 66th, the 20th, the Dragoons at times would have come out from their barracks in Jamestown, as seen on Sharp. Yeah, those Dragoons. In the Boer War, you'd have had the Manchester Regiment, the Gloucesters, it was the Buffs, every regiment went through here. Also, we had activity with the St Helena Regiment, our own island regiment, 1842 to 1862, and they were solely, that was unique in that they were solely based on St Helena Island, and they were the only line regiment to do so. They didn't go anywhere else, and they would have been around here, based here, but mostly they were based in town and their summer barracks in Deadwood, but they would have been obviously up here too. But all of this is 19th century. The St Helena historian Grant in the 1880s describes this as the most important and busiest fort on the island. So then obviously it's overtaken the castle in town and Mundon's and Banks's and Sandy Bay, a few kind of around there, and you could go on and on and on, because obviously this was a floating fortress, the island. In 1672, when the Dutch come up the Swanley Valley and captured a slave, and he led them up, and they had a battle involving 500 Englishmen that were waiting for them. They had the Battle of Peak Hill. The Englishmen ran and fled in the Dutch hot pursuit. They got to here, so you're talking 1672, right? They got to here. So it must have been some kind of fort, and probably in them days it was a wooden fort. We can only hazard a guess, maybe a basic stone fort. But then it's not really mentioned until Brooke in 1790, and then it's mentioned in the same breath as High Knoll being put there or being built to secure the inner island in case of a siege situation. That's why the oldest part of Ladder Hill itself is the outer wall. The outer wall dates from 1797. So the St Helena Artillery are based in here. So that's the connection to Oaklands, because he was the Lieutenant Kinnaird in 1816 to 1820 odds, was the commanding officer of the St Helena Artillery. So he would have done, this would have been his day job up here, and then he would have rowed back, or if he was tired, gone on the carriage to my house every night. And then one day in November, December 1811, he had to really get into action, because he had to earn his money that day, because he had to put down a mutiny of his fellow men from the garrison. They wanted to take Plantation, but he put the cannon on their road from Longwood, where they already previously had it out with the Lieutenant Governor in Longwood. They marched, they were drunk, there was 250 of them. They come from town, but by the time they got to Plantation, they'd have sobered up and there was only 75 left. He went out, offered them terms of surrender. They thought about it. Overnight, surrendered, they were decimated. The ringleaders were taken up Christmas Day, 1811. 5 were shot up there, and Boxing Day, the ringleader was taken downtown and hanged in the Barrack Square in Jamestown. See the stone? Some of the stone, apparently, on the best walls, or fortification walls, sometimes they used Purbeck stone and another one that eludes me, I'm not into stone, but that were ballast from ships. So when I got here, they went, yeah, we'll have that stone because the rock or the stone we got here, and also they had a problem with lime. They didn't find lime here until Aaron Johnson, a soldier, found lime, and then obviously the quality of the cement could improve. And they promised poor old Aaron, about 5 years before, they were offering £100, and when he found it in 1708, something like that, when he found it, they only give him 20 quid. And then they argued, they said, that's such a small quantity, Aaron, we're only going to give you a 5 or a 10, I can't remember. But yeah, so they cheated poor Aaron. But the quality of the fortifications improved. As you can see, this baby here, been here for 200 years. Right, these bad boys, they were put here in the Ellswick Ordnance Company guns from 1902. They're coastal defence guns, as you can see. There's one example in Woolwich Arsenal in London. They're getting rarer and rarer. They were once scattered all around the fringes of the old empire. It's a 6-inch gun. It fires a £100 projectile. Maximum range, this is for the geeks, maximum range 14,000 metres. It can fire at the rate of 8 rounds per minute. Obviously that baby can swing right round, so it can fire anywhere on the island. And its original idea, that's why the British government, the Crown got it in, was for the bore, just to tighten up security for the 5,000. Because obviously, if 1 or 2 or 3 have any ideas, silly ideas of doing anything very, very stupid, they know them bad boys are here. However, they got here too late. The Boers had already left. But they came into play in the Second World War when the Royal Engineers, detachments of the Royal Engineers were based here in Ladder Hill, and they trained men from the St Helena volunteers on the guns. One was my grandfather, eventually became bombardier, and he left the island in 1942 to fight overseas. But he did his training here under Royal Engineer officers, and he later volunteered and joined the Royal Artillery. He told me in 1941-42 they actually fired 3 live rounds all the way over the island. I don't know if they did it the same day, probably not. Such an amazing event for them young guys. They shot 3 rounds all the way over the island, live rounds, all the way to Prosperous Bay, which is on the other side of the island. So luckily they got their rangefinders correct on that day.